Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know what's worse right after lunch, having to speak after eating a great lunch or having to sit there and listen to it. But in any event, good afternoon. It's always great to get out and talk to everybody in the field and see what's going on. And I'm giving a presentation kind of like it'll be an overview of where the rulemaking effort went, and a lot of the background behind it. In retrospect, we probably should have had it earlier in the morning, but I guess we'll probably invite a little bit more discussions after this is over with. So I'm Les Smith, the manager of the Air Transportation Division, and along with John Duncan, we'll be answering the questions as we get get into the presentations. Cover the congressional mandates, some of the equipage, rationale, and then cover questions and a little bit of discussion afterwards. This is all based on a couple of things. One is the Public Law 112.95, 44, 70, 30, and actually NTSB recommendations as well. In the public law, it was a requirement to have helicopter or ambulance flights with medical personnel all under Part 135, except those flights that are conducted under training purposes, and then they don't have to comply with a lot of the weather minimum requirements that are imposed on 135 operators under this rule. Additional requirements of flight request and performance based on dispatch procedures, pilot training standards, safety enhancing technology, a lot of it which we've already talked about, HTOS, radar altimeters, and the flight data monitoring system. I'm going to go through this kind of fast because there's there's 4 topics that we need to discuss, and I know the discussion items are probably on everybody's mind now, so I'm probably not bringing up any more. The Flight Risk Evaluation Program determine whether the flight request should be accepted, and that's working with the OCC and the pilot to determine the parameters of safety for the flight. The Operational Control Center, and that's a requirement for those operations that have 10 or more helicopters. As far as the implementation dates, when we published the rule last April, it was a little bit tight, so what we did initially was went to a direct final rule to move the implementation date for all of those items that did not have a date associated with it. And we moved it to April 15th or April 22nd of this year. The Operational Control Center was already scheduled for April of 2016. Instrument rating for pilots moved to 2017, and the equipage was radar altimeters and HTOS requirement was already in the rule for April of 2017 in the flight data monitoring system or management system for 2018. We currently have a second rulemaking effort underway that was also a requirement by the same public law. And that particular initiative, we were required to initiate the second rulemaking within 180 days of the implementation of the first rule or the publication date. We've done that. It'll cover the pilot training standards, mandatory requirements for the training hours, crew resource management, flight risk evaluation, operational control authority of the PIC, and the use of flight training devices and line-oriented flight training. Additionally, it's the use of personnel safety equipment, helmets, seat belts, shoulder harnesses, and fire-resistant clothing for the flight crew members and medical personnel. Implementation for at least the rule and a lot of the guidance that we have to go along with that. Like I said, we published the rule in April of 2014, and over the course of the next couple of months, we went to direct final rule on a couple of items, along with technical amendments and clarifications. In October and November of 2014, we published the draft OpSpec A021, the AC 135, 14, and 8900 guidance for general training documents. We published those for comments. We actually got comments back by November, but there was a little bit of additional work that needed to be done by some of the associations, so we took that into consideration and extended the comment period to January of this year. That comment period has closed. We've taken those comments and we're in the process of going through all of the advisory circulars and the other documents that we had out for comments, and we're updating them based on the input that we've received. There's a lot of great comments, so it was a worthwhile endeavor. We're looking at publishing the full 8900 guidance that goes along with the op spec and the AC 12096 of March of this year. I don't know if it'll be out in time for Hilo Expo, but that's something I'm going to look at once we get back into the office after this meeting. In May of 2015, we're having the post-draft AC out for 12096, which is the AC for the Operations Control Center. And then our goal is to publish the final advisory circular in September of this year. An additional mandate by the same regulation was data collection and reporting by the operator, and this was this data collection was to generate a report that goes back to Congress. We actually had a link, I think, in the initial op spec that addressed this issue. We've since gone back and updated 821 to go back and just put in the number of items that were required to be reported upon. And I'm not going to go through the list right now. Let's see. The reporting form itself, or the template, was adjusted. And initially, I think, like I said, we had a link to the form. We took comments in based on some of the items that we had in the form and the changes that we made. I think we had unused transport, and we changed that to canceled transports. Flight accepted versus flight declined. We made those adjustments, and then we added a couple of definitions for flight and operation. The revised op spec will be published in March of this year. The reason for the delay, and we could have done this earlier, is the fact that in order to publish any op spec for data collection, we have to get the authorization through OMB for PRA, the acronym escapes me right. Paperwork Reduction Act. We have not received that authorization back yet, so we think we'll have it by March, so we're not going to publish the op spec twice. We will just wait and get the final out in March this year. The first report is due in January of 2016, so we realize that and we will take whatever data we get for this year and publish the report. It won't be a full year of activity, but we'll still, our goal is to still meet the January 2016 requirement for the first report back to Congress. Equipage rationale, radar altimeters. So a lot of this we've discussed this morning. It was a recommendation by the NTSB. It was a mandate by Congress, and the same regulation, or the FAA's Authorization Act. It applies to all Part 135 operators. What it does is it provides an additional tool to maintain situational awareness to include inadvertent IMC flights into whiteout, brownout conditions, and loss of horizon. Mandate for the equipage installation is April of 2017. HTOS, also another NTSB recommendation and a mandate by Congress. The HTOS systems that are out there at least have 3 to 6 degree arc second resolution, and the accuracy of it is subject to the database and GPS accuracy. The equipment installation requirement is April of 2017. Flight data monitoring system, both recommendations again by the NTSB and a mandate by Congress. Equipment installation in 2018. Corrections to the published regulations that we had out. We did technical corrections, and I'll go over those more in detail for 135, 609, 613, and 619. 609 was the VFR ceiling and visibility requirements for the Class G airspace. After the regulation came out, it was we noticed the industry's comment was that there was some confusion on, I think, the visual or VFR, so we added VFR to that specific paragraph for, so that it was clear for conducting VFR helicopter and air ambulance operations in Class G space. 135-621, on medical personnel, the technical correction was changed the requirements in A and 2 to 2A and 9. You have to have both of them together to see what we did. 135-613 applies to the transitions from VFR segment, not to IFR clearances. It was a adjustment to the terms proceed visually, and we also adjusted the guidance in the AC 135-14B to clarify this as well. 135-611 IFR operations at locations without weather reporting. The industry's concern with this regulation had restricted IFR operations in Class G airspace. We added the phrase regarding obstacle departures, and then we adjusted our guidance to reflect that change. 135-617, the PIC must conduct the analysis. This is flight risk analysis. The complete risk analysis worksheet, I guess it's in some of the guidance. It must be signed by the PIC, and it can be, like the question that we had behind it is whether or not it had to be in paper. We're clarifying that in the guidance that it can be an electronic signature as well. So it's up to the operator to determine how they want to do it. It's a performance-based rule, non-descriptive, so it doesn't, it provides that latitude for the operator. OCS, the Operational Control Specialist, when applicable, because it's only a requirement for those operators that have 10 or more helicopters. They participate in the risk analysis by ensuring it's a team effort between the pilot and the Operational Control Specialist to determine and make kind of assurance on both sides that the reported weather is good, and that the flight can be conducted safely throughout the entire time frame that they're flying, before they launch anyway. The Operational Control Specialist, in working with the pilot, evaluates the high-risk elements. If it's a high-risk area, then they have to evaluate that to higher management. And the Operational Control Specialist must acknowledge in writing, although an electronic signature will work as well, that the risk analysis is complete and accurate prior to the flight, so that it can be recognized by all parties that it can still be conducted safely. Risk analysis should be transmitted to the OCC. This is on the pilot's side or other locations by means of the operator, and that data needs to be retained for a period of 90 days. The Operational Control Center in the OCS, the participation is required by the rule. The duties are described in the regulation itself. It adds the second level of review over just having the pilot try to determine everything before they take off, because in many cases they might not have as complete of information as the information might not be as complete as possible due to sometimes the tempo of the operation. We want to make sure that the safety is enhanced, and we provided the guidance for the OCS personnel and the inspections for the facility. That guidance will be in our AC 12096. The authority, as appropriate, depending on the operation, will be in the operator's manual. And I say that as appropriate, because some of the operations might be so small that they don't have an operations manual. But at the end of the day, the PIC is still the authority to accept the flight. Briefing for medical personnel is explained in 135-621. I'm not going to go through all of these. If you have any questions on them later, then we can bring it up. The briefing for the medical personnel is required prior to each flight for air ambulance operations. It excludes the pre-flight passenger briefings per 135, 117. It's not required, and there's no grace period exists for medical personnel safety training. Inspector training, 8900 guidance. We're working on that. We plan to have that out in March of this year. Industry outreach. A couple things. As far as industry, we're going to have a couple of outreach programs. One is for the inspectors. It's like I said, the guidance comes out in March. At that time, we're going to have an outreach program to all of our inspectors through polycoms, probably going out into the field, webcasts, so on and so forth, so that we can push out the information and provide the guidance that they need to work with both the ACs and the 8900 guidance that they have out there today. On the industry side, we've actually been working with the industry through AMOA, HAI, through forums such as this. I was speaking to Matt a little bit before this meeting what we would like to propose at HAI for the Hilo Expo, in addition to the traditional kind of like meet the regulators meeting that we have. I think it would be good to have probably a 1-hour breakout session where we can have a larger audience in to go through some of the guidance material that we have and answer any questions that they had, because that particular forum attracts hundreds of people and we can get into a deeper audience at that point. The resources that we have for the rule itself is the operations principle of the POIs, the Federal Register, have a website link, and AFS 250, and you talk for as far as a focal point goes for AFS 250 and the helicopter ambulance rule. Rick Prosick is the branch manager, and Andy Pierce is kind of my focal point for all questions that we have in that regard. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to John Duncan, and we'll actually, how do you want to handle just the questions for on the helicopter ambulance rule?
I have a feeling that if we open it up for questions, that's where we'll finish. So let me cover a couple of things right quick.
Is that what the duct tape is for?
Yeah, that's what the duct tape's for. Beforehand, one, and I'm being responsive to the questions that help structure this thing. The next one on the list here was designated pilot examiner update. Let me just say that, and we'll support, we'll answer any questions you have specifically, but let me say we fully support the use of delegation to the maximum extent possible. So you will see us, if you haven't already seen us, clearly we're doing pilot examiner delegation. We've done that for a long time. We also have the authority and promote the delegation of authority for proficiency checks and those kinds of things within operations, check airmen as well as industry check airmen. So I think you'll see, particularly in the future, more support even for that. Also, I think connected to this was the stand down that we took sometime earlier in the year, or late last year actually, in our inspector training organization. We had an event occur, actually a couple events occur that got our attention. The AFS 60 operation, that it's called, was not operating at the standards that we wanted it to be operating at. So we took a stand down for about a month and a half, I believe, and reworked a lot of the processes there. Those are all back up and running, including the helicopter, all the helicopter operations, the currency for our inspectors, as well as the refresher and other courses that are associated. So those are up and running. During that period of time, we were very sensitive. I was very sensitive personally to meeting industry needs, and we shuffled people around all over the country, not industry, but our folks around all over the country to meet needs. And I'm not aware that we had serious problems in that regard. Now, we should be back up to speed, but we can talk about that if we're not there. That goes with some of the other things I've talked about earlier, and we'll talk about again. So let me talk then about what is listed here as the Consistency and Standardization Initiative. CSI has been around for quite a while. Every time I talk about CSI, or have talked about CSI in the past, I usually get eye rolling because there's a concern about ratting out your principal or ratting out your inspector and the implications that might have for retribution. I understand that. The CSI process is still there and will continue to be there, but I want to tell you about some other things that we're working and about how we may revisit that CSI process in the future and talk about it. First of all, as a result of the Modernization and Reform Act of 2012, Congress directed us to have an ARC, to put together an ARC to look at consistency and standardization within flight standards and within aircraft cert and in the operations between the two organizations. So we put that ARC together. It was chartered in April of 2012. The ARC did some great work. Some of you here may have been part of that. And they came up with about half a dozen recommendations, all of which we accepted. And I want to talk about how we dealt with those. The first was to develop a single master source for guidance for the organizations as a whole. Now, so that means that maybe FSIMS doesn't work as well as it should, and I'm sure you all have experienced that. It's an aging program. RGL also has some age. So initially, our concern was that this is a big project, an expensive project. It turns out that we have been able to, through the support of our consolidated IT folks within the FAA, they have offered up a system that will be called the Dynamic Regulatory System. And DRS is a very, very robust document management system for all practical purposes that will allow us to do what the ARC recommended with regard, with regard to document management. So the ARC actually said they would like for us and for the industry to be able to put in a regulatory part and get all of the documents, find all the documents that were associated with that regulatory part. DRS has the capability to do that kind of search, and actually some much better and more precise kind of searches. We've done a proof of concept, and we're moving forward with the DRS. We are in the decision-making process, but we're moving forward with DRS. Could be around as early as first quarter of 16, which is pretty quick for that kind of system. The next recommendation had to do with developing instructions for FAA personnel with policy development responsibilities. And we've the issue there was kind of what we talked about a few minutes ago, and that is I expect, as even now with the prescriptive rules we have in place, there's more than one way to comply with a regulation. There's more than one way to meet the standard in many, many cases. We've kind of gravitated over time to guidance that only looks at one way or maybe a couple of ways. And that's too restrictive. You need to have, as an industry, you need to have the capability to take different approaches to getting the job done. Particularly as we move to performance-based rules, there'll be many, many ways to meet the standards of a particular regulation. So you need the latitude to be able to exercise that kind of flexibility. And our folks need to have the skill set to look at the regulatory requirements, to look at the guidance that's available, and to see those flexibilities and allow you to exercise those flexibilities. Now, what I've been telling my folks now is that where they run into situations where they have looked at what you've proposed and they have looked at the regulatory standards that are involved, and they've found that the guidance that Les's and people and other folks in policy divisions have put together is the only thing that says no, and they think it should work, then they need to be on the telephone talking to Les or talking to his counterparts within the organization and talking about a deviation to the policy possibly, or a change in the policy that will allow more flexibility to get the job done. Now, when I'm talking to my folks, at this point I say I'm not promoting anarchy. I'm not promoting anarchy. I'm not saying they don't have to play by the guidance. They do. But they do have the flexibility, and they do have the obligation to critically think about what they're doing and raise those kinds of questions. So I expect them to do that. This takes me back to the theme I was talking about a little earlier. Don't hesitate to challenge folks. Don't hesitate. I mean, it's a friendly relationship, folks. It should be. But don't hesitate to say, hey, you know what? I think this works. I think this works. Can we talk to somebody and see if there's something here? Don't shake your head. Come on. We can do this. But we got to do it together. Now, so in that regard, we're looking at the training that our folks get to make sure that doing a gap analysis to make sure that we're giving them the kind of training that would lead them to this kind of behavior. The third issue was the rulemaking process, and that had to do with streamlining the rulemaking process as much as possible and making it more robust in terms of good preambles and well-written rules. The rulemaking organization has been doing that kind of work for a while. The process that's in place right now is a QMS process that involves continuous improvement, so we're continuously tweaking that process. We, meaning FAA and DOT, continuously tweaking that process to make sure we're doing it as efficiently and as effectively as we can. So we're working that issue. A fourth had to do with a concept called the Regulatory Consistency Communications Board. The idea here was, I wasn't on the ARC, so I won't speak specifically for what the ARC was looking for. But I think what the ARC was looking for was when we ask a question, we'd like to get an answer in a timely way, and that's a reasonable expectation. The challenge that we run into is quite frankly something will come into the building and you guys don't ask simple questions. You know, they're usually pretty complex. So something comes into the building and it goes to a particular organization, and that organization's also got other things to do. So it may sit there for a while, and then when they get a chance to look at it, frequently the outcome is, no, this is not ours. This belongs to somebody else, and so it moves somewhere else. And we go through the same cycle, so you can see what happens. Things just begin to bog down, and we don't get things moving. And it's not just within my organization. It's more broadly within AVS and broader than that across FAA, because General Counsel's involved in things. So it becomes a difficult process. So we needed a process in place to kind of to get that under control, and the RCCB was that proposed mechanism. We've adopted the ideas with some minor modification, and we have the RCC in place and ready to operate that now. And let me illustrate how committed I am to this. I have a full-time person who is committed to this work. She doesn't have a specific title yet. Her name is Leisha Bell. Doesn't have a specific title yet, but we've been referring to her as the ringmaster, because her job is to make sure that when things come in, that we get all of the parties who are all the stakeholders, the internal stakeholders who are associated with whatever that question is, and work it to a conclusion so we can get answers back. Another, I already covered the rulemaking clarity. The other concept that came about was something called a Regulatory Operations Center. And the idea there was that we needed folks ready to answer your questions and give you answers to those questions. After looking at that for a while, we've basically closed that recommendation on this premise. The RCCB, the Regulatory Consistency Board, does that job. And as I said before, you guys don't ask simple questions. The questions that come to us are typically not the kind of thing that we can answer in an hour. And so if you call at 2 o'clock in the morning and our ROC answers the phone and tell you, we'll be back to you in a few days, I might as well not have them working at 2 o'clock in the morning. It just doesn't make any sense. So we've closed that recommendation on the grounds that the RCCB covers that work. Now, another significant issue I want you to be aware of, because it's important, is that I said earlier, I've been in flight standards for almost 30 years now, and one of the things I think we have habitually done is that we have introduced evolutionary and good programs over time to deal with the changes that we had to deal with within the industry and associated with the work we have to do. One of the things we haven't done well is manage the behavior, manage the culture of our organization, and therefore the behavior of our employees with regard to those programs. Okay, so I don't mean to imply that my folks misbehave. You know, I have a little over 5,000 people. I suffer from the same challenge that you do, and that is you have to hire people. And that's always a challenging thing. So part of the challenge, part of that challenge, or managing that challenge, is managing the culture. Make sure that the employees understand the behavior that they're expected to exhibit, how they're supposed to behave. One of the primary challenges that we have is coming up, or is delivering a consistent product, and that challenge is exacerbated by virtue of the fact that the definition of a consistent product would be the same answer to two different people, or three, or four, or 100, based on the same set of facts. Well, Peggy Gilligan and I have talked about this many times before. Neither one of us in our nearly same length career have ever seen the same set of facts come up twice in a row. So it complicates the question of consistency. The question of consistency for us is delivering the right answer and giving you the flexibility to exercise, or giving you the ability to exercise the flexibility that is there for you to exercise. So how do we get that done? How do we get the kind of consistency that we need? First of all, it comes with a clear expectation on the part of every one of my employees that they're expected to deliver a decision that would be consistent with what their peers would deliver across the country. Across the country. That's an expectation now, an expectation in at least part of their performance expectations, and will be in all of our employees' performance expectations. Now, how do they do that? They do that in part by operating interdependently. I had a couple of conversations earlier and some at lunch as well about situations where folks in a FSDO, and most FSDOs are reasonably isolated, who come to a conclusion without talking to anybody else, and then you kind of get stuck with it. I can't live with that. They have to be talking to each other. They have to be using all the resources that are available to them. They have to draw on Les's shop and other folks to make sure that the decisions they're coming to are consistent with what we should be doing across the organization. Third, I expect them to think critically. I expect them to think critically. Goes back to the guidance situation that we talked about a while ago. I can write guidance, or I can have guidance written, and I can write it really prescriptively, so my folks can only do one thing on any given thing. If I do that, I'm paying them way too much for what they do. They need to be able to think critically. I expect them to think critically, work interdependently, and come up with consistent solutions. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because I need your help. I need you to be aware of that. I need you to push a little bit. I need you to work through your organization, your industry organizations, to pass back information to me where that's not working, so that I can effectively deal with it and make sure that we are delivering the kind of product that we need to deliver. So that's where we're going. And we're doing that through a couple of different means, and I personally need your support in doing this. I talked about this at an MRO conference some time ago, and it was an interesting conference because I was invited to talk on a panel on consistency, and when I got the agenda, it was on inconsistency. I thought that was a little prejudicial. Nonetheless, we had a good panel. We got a lot of feedback on consistency or inconsistency, depending on your viewpoint. And I was talking about this concept of changing the culture in the organization, and somebody finally felt sorry for him, I think, and said, "Yeah, you're right. It's a cultural thing. You got to change it. You just got to wait for people to die off." And I said, No. I cannot wait for people to die off. I'm too close myself. I've got to be able to take some action right now. So I need you to ask questions, critical questions. I need you to push back and say politely and say, "Hey, you know what? I don't think this is the right answer. I think we need to bring somebody else into this. We can do it. When we've got the people to do it, we got Tim Shaver and his folks to deal with those kinds of things." So that's a plea to help me out in that regard. Okay, I think I'm ready for questions, if you're ready for questions.
Paul Schaff from HAI. I'd like to start. Mr. Smith, we understand the complications of working with Congress, but I have kind of an overarching question, and that in regards to advocacy for the aviation industry on the part of the FAA, and I want to speak specifically about radar altimeters. Radio altimeter is old technology. For the most part, most of its functionality has been replaced by HTOS, but we'll put that aside for a moment. We have hundreds of aircraft that are operating underneath the membership of Helicopter Association that are being required to equip now with radar altimeter. In the commentary in the NPRM, they articulated very eloquently the fact that radar altimeter is actually not going to end up being a safety device in the aircraft. I think they did a really excellent job in that. So the FAA has given relief to aircraft that weigh 2,950 pounds or less. But that alone strikes people as kind of odd. So we want to ask, is there any remaining flexibility, given that this is a congressional mandate? Is there any room for discussing this? For instance, could we possibly propose HTOS as an alternate means of compliance if an operator found that using HTOS instead of a radar altimeter, an operator that wasn't in a brownout, whiteout, flat light condition? Is that something that we can work with the FAA? Or should we just forget about it?
So let me take a stab. First, I just got to understand. You're asking me if I can deviate from a congressional mandate. Is that what I understand?
Well, that's
no,
really
I'm just
like,
kidding.
Yeah. What can you do to go to bat?
Yeah.
Go to bat for like good common sense. Operators that are coming here and telling you things that you know as an aviator are true. You know, what's important is looking out and ahead of the aircraft is much more important than seeing what's underneath you, what you've just run into.
Okay. So let me address it this way. The rulemaking process is a very prescriptive one, and in terms of the process is a very prescriptive one. And we went through that process and basically adjudicated this question as a result of the rulemaking process, and we are where we are with that. And I think the things that you're addressing are pretty black and white in the rule for all practical purposes. And obviously there's two sides to this question, because I believe there's not only a congressional mandate, but there's an NTSB rec associated with radar altimeters as well. So
That's true.
On the other hand, we never say forget it, go away. We have processes in place where you can petition for rulemaking in various forms, and reopen the question, and we will evaluate those proposals as we always do. in that regard.
And so, thank you. Is it within the capacity of the FAA to grant an exemption to a rule that's been congressionally mandated?
An exemption is a rulemaking process, as that sort of I alluded to a minute ago, and the granting or denial of an exemption is based on the substance of the petition. So we will with any petition for exemption, we'll look at the substance of the exemption and the components thereof, the argument that's made, and make some decision based on that.
Okay, great. And one follow-on question to radar altimeter. Actually, quite a bit of the equipage requirements are how they'll be handled in terms of MELs, and that'll probably come up later. But that's another big concern of operators. Radar altimeter is actually a very temperamental piece of equipment, and we're concerned about it shutting down operations.
Yeah. Do you know the issue, the status there specifically?
I haven't seen anything on the MELs regarding radar altimeters, but as far as the helicopter operations, have we addressed that at all, Andy? But I mean, typically that comes out with the airplane anyway.
Okay. With respect to the radar altimeters and their necessity for each flight, I believe that those are covered by the MEL. I don't think that anyone has said in the congressional language or in any of our regulations associated with this that you cannot go if your radar altimeter is inoperative.
Okay. All right. So I don't know that issue paper has been developed or what it is specifically with this. It may already exist, should already exist.
Tim, can you help on that one? Tim Shaver? Okay.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks. We'll get you a clearer answer on that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Brian Foster with MedTrans. I have a couple questions on 135, 611, and 613. A couple of these things we brought up in the November meeting, but I still haven't heard clarity on them. I guess from the industry standpoint, one of our concerns is we understand that it's been explained that the regs are what they are at this point, but the guidance is going to clear it up. The problem from an operator standpoint is our principals are going to go by the regulation, and if the guidance is not in line with that, then there's going to be issues in the field. My question on 611 is with 611A3 in the direct final rule, it's talking about visual transitions after for a IFR departure. For the visual transition piece, what it's saying in there is if you have an ODP, you're going to utilize the weather minimums on that ODP for that departure with that visual transition. We agree with that wholeheartedly. It goes on to say if you don't use those, you got to use the VFR weather minimums in 609. We don't understand why that VFR minimum 609 piece is there, because if you're doing a visual transition on an approach or a departure, you're going to use the minimums on the procedure itself.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that was written for those specific areas where the weather wasn't, the weather wasn't available. I thought. On which one? That was 611.
611A3.
611A3, you said?
Yes, sir. That's
okay.
Correct.
Let's see. Let me find.
Well, that's okay. I don't know that we. If we can't answer it here, we'll get you a better answer.
Andy?
Let me say before we make an attempt that we won't have guidance that conflicts with the rule. It will illustrate or describe, but it won't conflict with the rule. We just can't do that.
Okay.
So.
And the other piece with 611 is in these regulations, it keeps talking obstacle departure procedure. And again, as we talked about in November, there's SIDs, standard instrument departures, or diverse departures. But 611, unlike other regulations, is instead of saying an instrument departure procedure or Part 97 procedure, it's talking specifically about ODP. You can have a SID, quite frankly, with the visual segment as well, but that's left out of this regulation totally. So, again, our concern from an operator standpoint is this is going to be very confusing from a principal standpoint on 611.
Okay, good. I appreciate that. Do we, everybody's alluded to the meetings we've earlier had. Do we already have this question and we're working it?
Actually,
Yes, sir.
I think what we did
Okay.
when we went back to we made the corrections, what we did was we wanted to make sure that if the helicopter got in, that they could get out. They could either get out on a obstacle departure if it was available, and if there wasn't one available and the didn't have the weather, then there was a mechanism to do that. Now, Andy, if you want to, you can elaborate a little bit more on that. But that was the objective of these two rules. One is where the weather is available, where the weather forecast is available, and where it isn't available. And that was the rationale between the two.
I think everybody in the room knows that our intent was not to entrap aircraft on the ground when they made a legal approach to a landing site and then they couldn't get out because the weather wasn't good enough for some kind of a rule. That was not our intent. Our intent was to facilitate more utilization of the IFR system. So you're entirely correct in what it looks like in the rule, that it's only talking about obstacle departure procedures. We intend that to mean obstacle departure procedure language not only in ODP but also in the SID, because many SIDs incorporate obstacle departure procedure language and minimums and routes and altitudes and all of that. So this is only applicable to the conditions where an aircraft lands someplace and there isn't any kind of departure procedure available to them off of a PINS approach at a hospital or something like that. This does not apply to airports where you have an published instrument approach procedure and there's a diverse departure available because there's no SID or no obstacle departure procedure published for that particular airport. You can depart from those just as you would if you had an airplane. It's not a problem. So we are articulating this position in the guidance documentation. I hope that that's sufficient and that we will have these outreach meetings with our own people to explain to them how this is to be interpreted. If we need to, we can go back to legal and get a legal interpretation on it. But again, the intent was not to have people stuck on the ground after they made a legal approach off of an instrument approach procedure.
All right, my other issue is on 611, and let me ask this question. So in 2009, AO21 for HEMS operators changed. The industry worked with FAA at that time to make the change in AO21. One thing that came out of that meeting, because our weather minimums in AO21, which are now 609, were raised. And that was actually driven by industry for that increase in our VFR weather minimums in Class G airspace. In the current AO21 that we have today, it says that we can use 602 or 603 after an approach. So if we shoot an approach, we can break out on that approach, and it might be 502. We can use 602 or 603. And this is not just pins. In the AO21, it specifies a standard instrument approach. We can then go anywhere within 3 miles at 602, 603 to a heliport or a landing area. That's no longer in the regulations, so that appears to us to no longer be an option for us.
Okay.
I'll pause there because I have a departure issue with the same involved there.
Okay. Any response there, guys, or do we just need to get back to them?
And just historical on this piece, if you need to get back, when you look at that and you think, okay, 602, 603 is less than the 609 weather minimums now, but what everyone has to remember is in 2009 when we increased our weather minimums, our VFR weather minimums at that time were 501, 502.
Right.
So what the industry was doing is we would establish a local area around our bases. Then we would have little pockets of local area where we shot the instrument approach so we could use that local 501, 502 to get to those hospitals.
Yeah.
So when that 501, 502 went away, we didn't want the 802, 803 now, so we shoot an approach to 502 if the weather was below 802 or 803, we're stuck right there at the airport. They have to ground ambulance a patient to a hospital that we can see right there a mile away. So that's where 602, 603 came along. So that's kind of the historics on it. We actually raised it, not lowered it.
Okay.
So
Okay,
the other
good.
piece. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just going to say, I remember most of the discussions around what you're describing. I just don't know the answer to the question about why it disappeared
Right.
and so forth. So we'll have to work that unless Andy's got something here.
Okay.
Or Mike Webb.
Sure. And just real quick, I'll throw in the last piece of this is from 611, the new regulation states that we can use the 602, 603 for departure if we have an ODP. But the problem with that is with the current op specs, if we went over there to a mile to that airport using the 602, 603, that airport we can see visually, it's not going to have an ODP or a SID or anything else. So we need the 602, 603 as per the op specs to get back to the place we just shot the approach so we can take that instrument departure out and get back in the IFR system.
Okay.
So that's just another piece of the new regulation.
Got it. Okay, good. You guys got that trapped? Okay. Good, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We will get back to you. Okay. What else?
Sorry, back to radar altimeters just for one moment.
Okay.
I misspoke earlier. Congressional mandate for radar altimeters only applies to helicopter air ambulance. So I just want to make that clear.
Right.
Secondly, the NTSB recommendation was for radar altimeters to be used in flat light and whiteout conditions.
Okay.
That being said, I was wondering if you could advise the room here and the online viewers what you could possibly recommend for air tour operators, specifically maybe in places like Hawaii, Grand Canyon, New York City, where clearly radar altimeter will be of little to no benefit to them at all. Is there any course of action that you could recommend to them or even to the associations that we could help them follow to get some relief from that rule?
As I said earlier, we went through the deliberative process to get where we are with the rule. If they have new information to provide that supports a different course, then we have the rulemaking process to deal with that.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Mike Lemie with MedTrans. I just had two questions. 135.168 addresses equipment for helicopters not within auto-rotational distance from the shoreline, but it doesn't differentiate between twin and single engine. And was that an oversight or?
Hard question. He said it doesn't differentiate between twin and single. I can't answer your question directly. We'll have to look and see why that was made. I know in conversation there was differentiation between twin and single. I don't know why in this particular case offhand, but we'll take that one and see what the story is.
And then the second one was they took the demonstrated task out of the 8900 for the 293 check ride as
Okay.
demonstrated, but there's no criteria on what that is. For the
Okay.
demonstrated IFR tasks, the en route. I've seen
okay,
that morphed
okay.
all the way from actually grading the task on a check ride to just, very laissez-faire. Is there
Yeah,
going to
okay,
be more
so-
guidance on that?
So you're saying that they've taken guidance on that out of the 8900? I'm just
Yeah,
trying
they
to understand.
migrated it into the 293.
Go that direction. I mean, you're talking about the 135, 293 check,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
and we took something out of the 8900.
It was in the 8900 was the only reference to that historically, that you had to demonstrate certain IFR tasks, the ability to recover from an inadvertent IMC situation, unusual attitudes, partial panel,
Yeah.
and an instrument approach. And we've gone from making remarks, during a check ride on the 8410 to now that it's in the 293, I mean, are they going to quantify exactly what tasks or what the expectations are on that?
Okay, well, let me look at that. I'll have to look and see, but I want to make sure what your perspective on it was. You think there was enough guidance when it was in 8900?
No, it's been vague all along, but now that
Oh.
it's pulled up out of the 8900 into the rule, I think it's going to have greater visibility by. I'm fortunate that I get to participate in check
got
rides
it.
with VISDOs around the country,
Yeah, okay.
and that's one of the rules that there's a.
Okay.
I
all
guess
right.
it's a CSI
I
item, or-
misunderstood what you were saying. Okay, got it. Got it. Okay, we'll look at that. You're basically saying you need better guidance to deal with the IFR demonstration stuff that's part of 293 now.
Well, the practical test standards don't apply any
Yeah.
VFR,
Right.
task condition standard
Yeah.
for IFR tasks.
Okay. Okay. Let us look at that.
So I'm wondering if that wasn't part of loss of control. What-
No, I think I understand what he's looking for, Al. We can talk. Okay, what else? Ma'am. I got to look up, don't I? Sorry.
Okay, I've got, I guess, 3 general areas I'd like to touch on, if you will. First, just to quickly follow up on Brian Foster's concerns about the IFR issues. Those issues have been brought up several times now, at least in my hearing, including at the November 5th meeting. And
Okay.
Andy, I know, has made a great effort to try to address them, but it sounds to me like they're not yet addressed.
Okay.
So just to be practical about how to solve this, because the effective date of the rule and these provisions is coming up quickly, could you agree to assign just a couple of people to work with an industry representative, let's say Brian, to just really nail this down, maybe arrange a meeting so that you could finally put those questions to
Yeah.
rest?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, we from my vantage point, we've been working pretty collaboratively with the industry on this right now. And what I don't know, we're raising questions, and some of them were predicated on the fact that we worked them in November, some were not. So I really don't know where these are. By the time we get these home, it may well be that we're hearing that it's coming in the March issue of 8900 that we're talking about, or it may be available otherwise. So we may have already addressed them. I just may not be aware yet of them. So the answer, I'll give you the answer from my vantage point. We will reach out to industry for support on these things, as we have been.
We completely appreciate your effort to engage in dialogue with us. You haven't been, John, at all of the meetings. Les was at one of
Right.
the last ones. Andy, unfortunately, poor Andy has been at almost all of them.
Right.
But what I'm just hearing is that there are some technical issues which I certainly don't quite understand. I'm not a pilot.
Yeah.
It seems to me that with just a very minimal amount of effort, folks could get together and put this to
Right.
rest, maybe with a 2-hour or 1-hour meeting of
Right.
people that actually know the subject area. So I just wanted to just, again, it's a question of accountability and
Right.
and putting this conversation to
Right.
rest, or that aspect of the conversation to rest. The other question I have concerns the RCCB, which is, for those in the audience. I mean, I thought your explanation was really interesting, and it's about, again, to use that word, accountability.
It is.
It's about having a single focal point in the FAA to get questions resolved. And I heard you say that you've assigned somebody from your office to be the ringleader?
No, ringleader, not ringleader, ringmaster.
Ringmaster,
There we go.
sorry.
That's a little different connotation, but
Ringmaster. So the question is, because the recommendation really involved having somebody from AFS, having somebody from AIR, and AGC, the legal folks,
Right.
all working together to get an answer.
right.
Have the other 2 offices committed to having people to support you in this effort?
Yes. Somebody has got to take the lead and do the organization so that it's not a function of getting a committee together every time we want to get the job done. Leisha's job is to be that person who has the responsibility for doing it. Now, at the leadership level, I'm committed to it. Dorinda Baker is committed to it. Mark Burry, in particular, has been the primary that has been working with it. He's committed to supporting it. And so, I think fundamentally What we needed was a focal point and a process, some governance to get those things together and observe. So I think it'll work. We'll see. If it doesn't work this way, we'll try it a different way.
So from this point forward, should Lisa be the point of contact?
Leisha, yes.
Okay.
Leisha Bell.
Leisha, okay. All right, thank you.
Uh-huh.
And she'll have an email address that you can share with us?
Yeah, I don't know. Is there a middle initial?
I don't know.
I'll keep talking and I'll have it in just a second.
Okay. So to transition to the third subject, and that involves OCC. Les, we heard you say there are a small handful of issues remaining with the OCC section of the rule, as you know. Mm-hmm. And two of them are related, and they go to what I'm calling the administrative aspects of implementation. And those two issues are the use of the phrase "in writing" in Section 619, subparagraph 4, I think it is. Mm-hmm. When you were just giving your presentation, your summary, Les, I thought you said that you were going to interpret in guidance the phrase "in writing" to mean or to include electronic signature. Did I hear you correctly?
That's correct. I mean, just the acknowledge of it says that you can that they can do it electronically or in writing, and the same thing for the pilot.
I'm asking, and the reason this was of concern was that, well, there are a couple reasons it was of concern. That phrase "in writing" I don't think is used anywhere else in Part 135 or Part 121. The word "signature" is. And so, and if you also look at the preamble, and the NPRM preamble, I think, to the rule, it strongly suggested, and some of your inspectors are thinking that it means, actually having to write something on a hard copy. More specifically, the hard copy pre-flight risk assessment that the pilot is using. And that's not capable of performance. And so that question of the use of that phrase "in writing," because it's not used anywhere else in the rules, at least not in those two, not in Part 121 and Part 135, it suggested that it meant something other than signature or electronic signature. So again, this goes to the issue of how the FSDOs are going to be enforcing the rule and providing oversight, and whether or not your guidance is going to be consistent with the plain language of the rule. So that's a concern. The other concern, while I'm at it, is the use of the concept of in the role of pre-flight risk assessment, because it's pre-flight risk assessment. In the regulation, it says that the OCS is supposed to confirm that in his or her judgment, the flight can be conducted safely. But the role of the OCS in the pre-flight risk assessment is whether the flight can be initiated safely. Conducting the flight is, as you said, it's the pilot's responsibility. So again, the use of that phrase and what it implies is of concern. And we recommended that, and recommend that those 2 points be clarified officially somehow, so that inspectors aren't reading the regulation and enforcing against the regulation, when that was not probably the intent of the writers of the regulation to create a role for the OCS that's impossible to perform.
Is the preamble clear? I'd have to read.
The notice of proposed rulemaking preamble indicates, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but it indicates that it's going to be written on a hard copy. That's how we read it.
Okay. So we'll look at that because
I think our guidance is clarifying that, to say that you can use an electronic signature.
Right. And again, we appreciate that the guidance is going to say that, because that's the way we believe it should read.
Right.
But that may not be how your inspectors enforce against the plain language of the rule, because again, you used a phrase "in writing" that's not used anywhere else in the regs. The implication is that means something special.
Right.
signature is used elsewhere in the regs, and you've interpreted to include electronic.
Okay. We'll resolve that. If it requires a legal interp, we'll do what we need to do in that regard. Okay? Thank you. What else?
I have some questions that were sent in, so maybe I can just run through those quickly. This one we've been talking about, and I don't know, I guess we quasi-discussed it and answered it, but in deference to the individuals watching it on the internet, let me read it through. Part 135 operators that fly VFR daylight-only flights are required to equip aircraft with radar altimeters in a relatively short time frame, April 24, 2017. This equipment will do nothing to increase the safety in our non-EMS operations that are primarily 135, 136 VFR air tour flights with other non-tour operations. The radar altimeter equipment will significantly increase our cost to acquire, install, and maintain this equipment in our aircraft. Is there any possibility to amend the rule to change the requirement for radar altimeters in non-EMS operations? Has the FAA determined how many aircraft will be affected by the rule? It is our opinion that the economic analysis done during the rulemaking process significantly undervalued the cost of complying with the rule and overvalued the benefits. Our current estimates for our aircraft are as follows: $20,000 for the equipment, STC, and labor, 20 hours. $15,000 for our aircraft out of service costs for 3 days. The future training costs are yet to be determined. There are over 70 air tour aircraft in our area alone. It is our position that the costs are not outweighed by the benefits. Operations in other air tour areas include an additional 200 helicopters.
Okay, so I appreciate the concern. As I said before, this rule is in place. If there's a case to be made for rulemaking that approaches this differently, then that avenue is open for folks to petition for that kind of thing. I wrote down how many aircraft. I don't remember how many aircraft, but certainly that was part of the calculation. But apparently there was a difference of opinion about that calculation. So I don't know what else to say there.
Okay, I think I know the answer to this one, but it appears that there are separate FAA regulations covering civilian versus public use aircraft performing the same mission. What is your view on FAA oversight of public aircraft operations when engaged in HAA?
Carl Johnson's going to be here.
Yeah, he's going to do the presentation on public aircraft.
There he is, back in the back, and do the presentation and deal with it. Fundamentally, it's not different rules. It's that some rules do not apply to public aircraft. Is what it amounts to. I think I understand what they meant, and Carl will walk through those kinds of things this afternoon and deal with them. If they really meant opinion, I don't have a specific opinion.
Okay, fair enough. Kind of a little off the beat, but I guess they figured you're here, so why not ask?
Why not?
What is the status of the third-class medical exemption?
The third-class medical exemption, as everybody knows, AOPA and EAA petitioned for an exemption some time back. We are pursuing rulemaking activity around that third-class medical question, and it's ongoing as we speak.
Okay. It appears that the IFR mandate in the HEMS rule would give an indication that the FAA views that as a safety enhancement and a valuable tool to the helicopter industry. What are your thoughts on a restoration or initiative on cost-effective certification of single-engine IFR rotorcraft that would be available to the fleet and enhance IFR operations?
That's one of those that's one of those difficult questions that I was talking about earlier. I don't have a specific position. I don't know that I've given much consideration to that. You got any?
No, Lance is looking like
Lance
he has
is
one.
looking like he's got something.
Okay.
I should say from an operational standpoint, we haven't pursued that.
So I would look to Paul here a little bit, and I don't know how much has been passed out, but we've been approached by industry to consider, in broad terms, relaxation of our certification standards for single-engine Part 27 IFR. When the rules were promulgated many, many years ago, starting with Part 29 to transport helicopters, the intent, and I'll say with industry support, was to have a regulation that mirrored the Part 25 requirements in terms of certitude and availability. And it kind of flowed into 27 because the turbine aircraft were becoming pretty well used even in 27 environment. So those similar requirements slowed down. We've responded initially to the proposals that were put forth by industry. We think there's some more legwork to be done by industry, but by all means, we're open to looking at doing something. As I've told Paul before, my general impression is, yes, we don't have a lot of Part 27 IFR operation, and it can only be one of two reasons. Either the operators don't want to do it because it's too expensive to certify their pilots and maintain the aircraft and keep the pilots current, or our regulations are so onerous to get an aircraft certified to do such that we're the blockade to that happening. And from the rotorcraft director perspective, I think we need to be open to looking at potentially making some adjustments so that it would open the door a little further, and then one of us will be proved. One of the two scenarios would be proved right. So.
Okay, I'm just curious. My understanding was there's a AC involved, an AC that gives guidance to the protocols to get this done, and that the AC is more of a concern and issue than the regulation itself.
Yeah, I mean the advisory material that accompanies the Appendix B to Part 27 is prescriptive on what you need to do to get your aircraft certified for IFR operation. And it's those prescriptive rules that really force companies, if you read it with modern avionics, into duplex or triplex systems for SAS and autopilot, as well as some other systems. And the argument being that things have changed enough in industry with some of the reliability of some of the more modern digital as opposed to analog systems out there, that maybe there is room to do something different than what is prescribed in the advisory material right now.
Yeah, I was just curious on the general philosophy of an advisory circular, basically having the overriding mandate versus the regulation.
Well, I wouldn't call it the mandate. Actually, the Appendix B to Part 27, the rule itself is prescriptive, and the advisory material gives a prescriptive way of meeting that. It's very clear at the beginning of the advisory material, as we do with all of it, this is not the only way to comply. It is a way to comply. And, you know, the AC material was written back a number of years ago. I don't know, Larry, when the last time it was changed, but it incorporated those ways that we knew how to do things back then. So.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. The other one was, it appears that the FAA is imposing Part 121 standards in the OCC issue and the OC specialist issue. Why is that occurring that 121 is being placed into a 135 environment?
My recollection of the language, having reviewed it last night, is that our reference to Part 121 had to do with fatigue issues associated with 121. So it wasn't 121 procedures. It was around the fatigue experience we have associated with Part 121.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions, thoughts? Here we go.
Just a six-part question. And
Six-part.
I'm
okay.
kidding.
Just wanted
Am I limited to 5 too, or is that just Milton's rule? Can I do more than 5?
You want us to go get coffee?
No. Stay
Okay.
here. I'll be quick. A follow-up to the IFR question, and I think it's probably directed toward Rick and Andy. You mentioned that the intent was to preserve. I'll ask it this way: was there any intent in the rewrite of the IFR regulations to change the IFR regulatory structure? Was there any intent to further restrict the use of IFR? Because I think if we get that sort of basic,
I think just the opposite.
you shook your head no, but I don't know if that's an official recorded response.
So you can hear me say it. No. No, we didn't intend to change anything that's already existent. We're trying to allow the PINS approaches and things like that to operate within that system. There are other things that we didn't talk about a few minutes ago that I think a sidebar, I think a meeting, as you guys suggested, would be a very good idea to clear the air on what these regulations are trying to accomplish, not to get rid of the other existing regulations, but fit within them for these new types of approaches. We want to support the technologies and so on that are out there, but we want to do it in an organized fashion so that nobody gets hurt.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Similar to discussions of intent, getting back to the OCC, the OCS, the OCS's role in the risk assessment review process. In the guidance we talked, or in the guidance that we previously commented on, there was a lot of discussion of the safety responsibility that the OCS shares in the conduct of the flight. And as Irene very correctly pointed out, the OCS's role traditionally and in traditional guidance and things like that in AC 120 96 discusses that the OCS is there as an advisory position, things like that, and certainly has some role in the initiation of the flight and can review those things. But without without being actually in the cockpit, there's a very limited amount of input that the OCS can have on the conduct of the flight. So I'm just wondering, and we certainly commented on this in guidance, but as you guys move forward with the completion of that guidance material, how do you see, can you comment on how you're seeing that safety role of the OCS? You guys should have sat on the same side of the room, because now I got to have eyes in the back of my head.
Well, do you guys want to comment before I jump into this? You don't have to.
We were having a sidebar and we didn't get everything you just said. Don't want to belabor it, but go ahead and just repeat the gist of your question.
No, I was asking on the discussion of the OCS. In the comments, we talked about the safety responsibility of the OCS. And as Irene pointed out, we have an issue of the OCS being more intricately involved in the initiation of the flight, but in the conduct of the flight, the OCS's role diminishes. It's the PIC's primary safety responsibility. So I'm just wondering. We commented on this in the guidance. I'm wondering if you guys can comment on how you are approaching that as you complete the guidance for the March deadline.
Okay. The OCC is engaged with the pilot to verify that everything that the pilot has put into his risk analysis is correct. It's based on true information. For instance, the weather that he had to make his decision on a risk is accurate, complete. And the OCS is a backup to the pilot. The safety aspect of it is two eyes looking at the same subject, the same task. So the OCS is acknowledging in writing, and in writing, when we say in writing, our intent for that was that it be documented somehow, not that it be written out by longhand and signed with a person's hand necessarily, but that there be a documented record that is then retained for 90 days on what was decided. The OCS is also, if there are high-risk issues that the pilot is facing, the OCS is there to help him figure out if there are any mitigating changes that they would make to the planned flight that would reduce those risks. Further, then, the OCS is responsible for taking this forward, if an OCS exists, to take it forward to a higher level of management for approval of very high-risk situations that exceed a threshold that the operator has defined. We're not defining that threshold for the operator. So all of these things are procedures. The statute says that there will be a risk evaluation process. I believe it was something along those lines. And we are trying to be concordant with the statute and still leave it to the operator to define how it is they're going to accomplish this. Does that help?
I think it's, yes, it does help. It helps me. I think it speaks to intent, and it helps us get ready for what to expect in March if we hold the deadline.
Okay, now, the advisory circular for the OCS is still in the works. It has not been released for public comment or anything. We anticipate that, I think we said in May. Anticipate publication of that by September. I believe that was the date that we have it. Whatever the date was in the PowerPoint presentation is still correct. So a lot of this information will be embedded in that advisory circular. The 8900 guidance for our inspectors is intended to explain to them what they should be looking for in terms of compliance with this. So the language, just as I just expressed it, pretty much is what's going to be in the 8900 guidance for the inspectors, so they understand what their role is in determining whether or not that particular organization's risk analysis evaluation program meets the intent.
And the only thing I would add philosophically is that short of manipulation of the controls, if the conduct of the flight is not at some level a shared responsibility, you're not getting the use out of your OCC you should be from a risk management standpoint.
Interesting. I have to think about that one. Finally, and to close at least my portion out, as we continue with the guidance process, I think we're still a ways away, at least a few months away, or a month and a half away from final on some of the stuff that we've already seen. And this is just a comment. Obviously, all the associations support a very robust rule and have been looking forward to it for a very long time. So if there's anything else that we can do to provide, for the practicality of that robust rule, please let us know, and we remain open to continuing that process. So thank you.
Good, and thanks for the support that you guys have provided. I appreciate it. To Irene's comments a minute ago, one of the things I hate is when my boss says, "Oh yeah, we'll get you some help," when I've already got the job done. Andy just said he's welcoming all that help, so that works for me too.
Just Sir Brian Foster again. Just a quick clarity question on a couple of things, because as this discussion goes with OCC, something has jumped out at me from an interpretation standpoint. And I know, Andy, you're getting some exercise here, but with the acknowledge in writing, is the intent of acknowledge in writing that the OCC acknowledges back to the pilot, or is it just that he acknowledges once he's done those steps himself that they're complete and then it's stored? So he has to, for every flight, no matter what the risk is, he has to acknowledge back to the pilot some method in writing. That's my clarity question.
No, the acknowledgement is that the OCS has reviewed what the pilot has provided him and is in concurrence with what he has done, that everything is accurate and complete. And that acknowledgement is then what goes into his file. The risk analysis that the pilot actually does stays at his place. So there would be probably two files on this whole thing, unless you have, I'm sorry? Right. It's up to the operator to develop that. And I can see the case where the pilot might do something longhand on a form that he sticks in his pocket that he has signed, makes the flight, but before he makes the flight, he calls the OCS and says, "Here's what my ratings are for these risks. Do you concur?" And if it's clear blue and 22, as somebody's said, recently, if there's no risk involved, then it's a very easy process for him to take the necessary action with the OCS, that is, to concur with that, acknowledge it, and put it in the file.
And just from I'm really glad to hear that. That takes a lot of my consternation away with this issue, because I think myself, and I know a lot of the industry folks were, they were interpreting this as every flight, regardless of the risk level, the OCC had to communicate in writing to that pilot out there trying to wait to go on that flight. If that's not the case, and then this is a good thing, and we really need to see that in guidance then.
Yeah, okay, I got it. I can't help myself here. I got to go back to philosophically. We got to learn to deal with the regulations, but philosophically, we also got to be careful that we don't lose sight. We don't lose sight of what this is all about. The example that was used was clear blue in 22, I think was the phrase that you used. If you backed over your dog in the driveway on the way to the airport, there are some risk involved in that flight. There is some risk involved in that flight, and that's got to be taken into account as well.
Agreed. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that is it's flight operation. We're looking at the flight operation. Some of the people that have looked at this rule have been concerned that for every single leg of a flight or any change they make en route, let's say they're returning to base after they've accomplished their original mission, and now they get a call that the operator, the OCS, wants them to divert to another pickup scene. He doesn't have to do a complete risk analysis, land someplace, do that risk analysis before he can go ahead and proceed with that operation if the possibilities have already been looked at that could happen, and it could happen in these particular areas before they took off on the first flight of that operation. So there is, and this is explained in the new advisory documentation that will help people understand how to apply this rule. We know that kind of thing can happen. There's no reason why they would have to do to land someplace, do a risk analysis, and then take off again if they've already covered that ground, and the only thing they have to worry about at this point is this weather the same? Do I have sufficient fuel? Am I over my time as far as fatigue? Those kinds of things. And they can do that over the radio with the OCS. So there's no need to have the flight actually land someplace and do another risk analysis from top to bottom if they've already covered that stuff before they took off on that flight operation.
Anybody else? Okay. Oh, here we go.
I find myself falling in the abyss with that last explanation, because the same thing, his analogy of running over a dog in the driveway before you came to work, what about that flight you took, and you mentioned communicating over the radio? So are you implying that you have to have uninterrupted two-way communication with that flight at all times? I mean, you got to watch how you propose some of these things, and that's not always the case. The other thing, just while you're meditating on that, the other kind of part of this, and you mentioned working with the regulations and working in that, and just from a ground level view, because I'm the one that sits in my building with the FSDO guys, the POIs, PMIs, PAIs, and watch them struggle and labor over meeting this product that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, your uniform product, the product that you want to present out there.
Right.
And just as a general comment, I think they are being driven further and further and further into check the box mentality. If I can't check the box, I'm not giving the product back to you, okay? And that's kind of their goal, is checking that box. And if they can't check that box with something behind them, concrete behind them, they're not going to check the box.
Right.
So you're taking all the ways that we could have worked with the rules like we have done for years, not that was good or bad, but these guys on a ground level are being forced into these boxes with no latitude to move without going up for Mother May I, and that's not always done because their bosses are being put in that box, a very tight box. So that's just kind of a comment. I understand, the product that we had, years ago seemed to be more universal and more reasonable than the product we're getting today with all the Mother May I's and I don't understand this and defining the difference between the two terms that Irene used a minute ago. So that's just kind of an observation. And I understand, I work with that in my own organization. I want my people to be in a box, but, you take away the free thinking sometimes, too. It's beneficial to the situation.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, just think about what you say on these things and how you phrase those, because you know what? That's what we're taking back and we have to work with when it comes out of your mouth.
I couldn't agree more. You've got a great point on trying not to be overly prescriptive on how these things need to be done. That's why I said that these procedures are to be developed by each operator to suit that operator's requirements within the confines of what's in the regulation. As far as the case where are you saying that we have to have two-way communications? How else did he get the request in the first place? If he was en route, he was. Well, yeah, that's another whole subject. Yes, we recognize and agree that there is a difference, and there's limitations on what the comm center should do.
That's communication. That's not our FCC.
Yes, but that's the comm center's position or job, is to make those communications back and forth with the OCS.
Yeah.
At that point.
Okay.
He's doing risk analysis through the comm center.
That would be how would you have to do it. If that's how you have it worked out, that's how you're doing it.
They're not. They're not this OCS. They're trained. I get way out of my. These are more proactive.
And this is also covered in the guidance. We talk about, and you'll see whenever you get the guidance, that we've addressed the subject of communication specialists.
Yeah, I don't think we can resolve this, the specifics of this at this meeting.
That's fine.
However, this is a conversation that we need to continue to have because philosophically this becomes very important. We need to take advantage of the opportunities we have here by the creation of the Ops Control Center and use it to make sure we are in fact reducing the risks that are associated with operations. That's the purpose. That's the reason it was created. And also I want to be very, very clear that you don't misunderstand what I was saying earlier. And that is, I'm trying my best to take the boxes away from them. I'm trying my best to take the boxes away from them. That's the point. That's the reason I need for you all to say, when you're confronted with the check the box sort of thing, this is not working for me. We need to find a different alternative here because this is not working for me.
Okay.
Got to have that.
Last thing, I thought Chris or Eileen or one of my friends back here would bring it up. What the 10-hour duty time for OCS? There's been a lot of discussion about that within the groups, and I'm surprised it didn't come up here. But there are 38 opposing comments to the 10-hour. Is that what I heard?
I didn't hear any. Not at one.
On our comments to the rule. Come on, Chris.
Yes. I'm just kidding.
Give me some help.
To Milton's comment, we were able to have a brief conversation with Mr. Duncan and Mr. Smith before the meeting. We have sent over a proposal to address the difference between the 10-hour versus 12-hour duty day as it applies to operational control specialists. So what we've done is suggest a direct final rule that would change all the 10s to 12s based on the fact that we had 34 comments in the MPRM process that were opposed to the 10-hour duty day, and the fact that there is no evidence that the current practice of a 12-hour duty day is somehow less safe than a 10-hour duty day would be. For the benefit, though, of the FAA folks in the room, AMOA is doing a study of pilot fatigue. We've already had several of our operators commit to this. They're pilots wearing bracelets and things like that, measuring their fatigue. And I fully expect, excuse me, that whether or not the rule is changed, we're going to do that to the operational control specialists as well. I think it's very important that we know what the reality, what the science is behind their fatigue level. So we're going to participate in that, but I'm happy to have you guys comment on the proposal for a switch to 12-hour shifts.
Okay, good, and we'll take a look at it. As I said earlier, we'll take a look at that proposal. Let me also say, in light of what you just said about collecting data on the pilots, and I think you proposed to collect data on the OC, the specialists, right?
Correct. I'm proposing it. I haven't done it yet.
Right.
I'm proposing it.
So there is a conceptual mechanism in Part 117 called fatigue risk management systems. And fundamentally what that means is under 117, a carrier can propose an alternative means of complying with the rule that is a different mechanism for complying with the rule, and demonstrate that they can meet the standards of the rule through that alternative means, and collect data to support that they have done that. That's a mechanism that could be used in an exemption environment potentially. Just conversationally.
Certainly, and to continue the conversation. In fact, the entire reason we're doing the pilot, not the entire reason, but a portion of the reason is of doing the pilot study is to build an FRMS that all of our members can use to manage that fatigue when it comes up to the pilot situation. I think applying the FRMS to the OCC, the OCS role, is something we would certainly consider. And if it provides relief from the rule, if no other relief might be available, we would certainly be interested in that as well. So thank you. Just for the purposes of the folks at home that may not be aware, the proposal that we submitted also simplified, I think, in our opinion, it certainly simplified some of the language around the OCS's role in the risk assessment evaluation and the record kept of the risk assessment, the OCS's risk assessment acknowledgement. And I think that if it's possible, some simplification or clarification. I mean, and I do this all the time. You write something, you put it in the world, you find out it's more open to interpretation than you thought. And I think that we're finding that in just, I mean, this is a 2 or 3 sentence, happy to glad kind of change that may increasingly simplify what we put out there. So that's my plug.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Let me add one thing.
I have one more thing, and you'll be glad to know I got to catch a plane at 4:30. So anyway. One last thing, and it came to me here, and I pushed this when Mr. Pratt was in a position to listen to these things. The one thing that struck me as odd through my 30-some years in the EMS helicopter operations is we have never had a POI do a route check or go on a flight with us on a real operation. Now, I understand that in 30 years ago you were dealing with BO-105s and Jet Rangers and things like that. We started with Hughes 500D. Today it's not that way. There's plenty of room, plenty of capacity for your POIs to ride along. And I think some of these things that Mike and Brian and I have tried to express here, and Chris, would be resolved or easier to understand if these guys would actually ride along and get a taste of the real operation. We have jets on our certificate. We had to take a guy all the way to Bahamas just to get approved to go over water, okay? Why are your POIs not required or tasked with taking 1 or 2 rides a year, 1 or 2 route checks a year? It blows my mind that you can regulate from a distance like that, or even be understanding how the operation works without being in the operation. Your ACO people, they get their hands dirty with all the engineering and all the nuts and bolts and all those things.
Right.
You know, they come out and look at the helicopters, but we don't have the POI participation on a level that I think would be beneficial to the industry, I think.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. We do have a requirement for some level of en route inspections. Typically, obviously, that's limited to aircraft that are capable of accommodating that. So thanks for that. And make that offer to your, if you have the opportunity, make sure your POI is cognizant of that.
So they're required to do that?
There is some requirement. There is requirement, yes, based on the fact that you can do it.
To my knowledge, in the 30-some years, not one POI in the history of Metro Aviation has ever gone on a real flight.
Okay. I'll have to look. I say there's a requirement. We do have a requirement for en route inspections on a broad range of things. I don't know whether there's been some, whether they have not required that for HAA kind of operations or not. I don't know for sure. I'll check that. But you said you had airplanes, right?
We have airplanes. They never go on a real flight. They do the route checks prior to putting the airplane on a certificate, but they don't go on a route flight on that either, route check or an actual flight.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We had lots of volunteers for that one.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All righty. I guess I'm glad we were able to accommodate everybody's questions, and I think we, again, owe a good round of applause for Les and John for really bringing us up with